discovering
negros y indios nativos somos los verdaderos israelitas.
A cemetery of sorts, but it was not marked.
Part of the Indians' problem is in assimilating.
In the name of the Father, Our Lady of Good Studies,
Pray for us.
Our Lady of Good Studies,
Pray for us.
Our Lady of Good Studies,
Pray for us.
in the name of the Father.
Not sure we'll ever get a final answer.
Anytime.
Which is 5 to 10 times as high as that. It's because the records are so poor. They just didn't bother keeping track of children who died. I think that's unacceptable.
In my family, we lost two of my great uncles, and they died at residential school back in the 1910s. One of them didn't come home, and the other one did come home. He was very ill with tuberculosis, and he died very shortly after he came home. The two deaths had a great impact on my family. In fact, really changed everything. My great-grandparents decided at that point that they did not and were not willing to lose any more children. And so they ended up really running away, as the family story goes, in the middle of the night, running to Regina. At that point, there was a pass system, and you had to have permission from the Indian agent to leave your community, and anybody had the right to ask to see your pass if you were off reserve. So they really, when they fled to Regina, they really had to lie low like they were illegal immigrants in their own country. I mean, my great-grandparents spoke their language perfectly, beautifully, spoke Cree, and they were very deliberate in not passing that down to their children and in not passing that down to their grandchildren. They didn't want us to know the language because they were so afraid. Our family went back to Brandon Residential School to just walk through it and to be there, to try and do something small to honor them, to honor their loss, just to walk where they had walked, to be where they had last been. In the 1970s, we understand that a group of Girl Guides were planting trees and ended up discovering what was a grave site, a cemetery of sorts, but it was not marked.
Part of the Indians' problem is in assimilating with the rest of the nation.
So much horror and terror went on. When I think about the propaganda, it just, it's really, really painful when you know what actually occurred and when you know the impact in your family of what actually occurred and what you've lost because of it.
News Magazine salutes Education Week with films of an Indian residential school. They learn not only games and tradition, but the mastery of words, which will open to them.
A lot of that public perception is bullshit. Oh, pardon my language. But I have a very strong feeling about the way we were portrayed. They didn't portray us as, hungry, conniving, cold. I entered in 1948, and all through the 50s and part of, I left in early part of 60. My mom and my dad and my grandparents were really very spiritual. They believed in the Creator to a fault. And the fact that we lived at a time where we didn't have any the amenities that we had, running water, electric lights, heat, electric heat. So my mom always thought in her head, my boy, you're going to have all these amenities, you're going to have a good life. So when the clergies came in, of course, that was the attitude of our parents. In spite of all what was her reasoning, we didn't know. All we knew was that we were incarcerated. And that first year, we didn't like our parents. We didn't like our grandparents. We didn't like our extended families because of what had been pounded into our heads that Indians were no good.
See flames and smoke so.
We had no culture. We couldn't talk a sensible language. So that was the start of my indoctrination, where they say, kill the Indian in a child. That's exactly what they were doing, killing. When you left the residential school, it was very, very isolated incidents where people would go back and live on reserve. We were gone. I didn't return for years and years. I was on the move. So because of that shame and that, the reluctance to be able to relate to a family, I started realizing why my mom allowed me to go into residential. I graduated at 32 from civil engineering. And as I was coming down receiving my award, was my mom against the wall. Her head. I'm sorry, I've told this story before, but I think that's the most significant. That's the hardest thing to be able to realize, that my mom, almost 1,000 miles away, I graduated in Alberta, and my mom was living in Fort Alexander, just north of Winnipeg here. Who should be sitting against the wall? On that day was my mom. Her goal of having me graduate, what she didn't even understand in the early years, as to graduate. She was sitting right there on my day of graduation. All the abuses I've suffered, everything that's happened through my life, do not compare to what I experienced that day. I shouldn't react the way I do with this idea, but I think my whole life, the whole purpose of why I got incarcerated, the whole reasoning sits on that scene.
In the name of the Father, Our Lady of Good Studies,
Pray for us.
Our Lady of Good Studies,
Pray for us.
Our Lady of Good Studies.
Pray for us.
In the name of the Father.
Not sure we'll ever get a final answer, but I'm absolutely convinced the number is much higher.